You're live.
Okay, we're live. So I know, Abby, is it you? Is it Graham? Just trying to get an update from the committee as to what's happening in Ways and Means, what they're thinking. See if you can talk to us a little bit. I just found out today at Money Chairs that they're got some language that I think is going to come back to us on 315. The language isn't set, but I gather what they're attempting to do is. So can you kind of brief this committee on what's happening? Because when it comes back, we're going to be asked to express an opinion. So, or provide an alternative. So, floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. This is the annual link to federal statutes that typically the legislature passes, linking up to a certain version of the federal income tax code and applying it to the tax year that's currently being filed right now. So for individuals filing this tax season, this is for tax year 2020. In H315, there was the sort of typical link up that came over from the House. The Senate did strike that language and put in a requirement that both bodies work together to link up for tax year 2020. So that's now back in the House. And my understanding is that the link up will be addressed this week. So the Ways and Means Committee has been looking at language that again would link up for tax year 2020. It would pull in federal income tax laws as they're in effect on December 31st of 2020. So that would include the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act at the end of December, everything that was passed, in calendar year 2020. What is also being discussed is the treatment of this new retroactive exclusion of unemployment compensation. Because of the federal law that was passed in March, which is quite unusual to have this retroactive effect. It does impact tax year 2020. The language under consideration would adopt for tax year 2020 the first $10,200 of unemployment compensation that the federal government is excluding from gross income. So that would flow through to Vermont. There is also, because there is actually a separate provision for the property tax credit, the household income definition also references federal adjusted gross income. And this language makes it clear that as of that despite this new exclusion in the federal law, as the way that current law pulls in all unemployment compensation as household income, that would continue for tax year 2020. And then the language uses slightly different effective date language to make it clear that these are changes for tax year 2020. So there have been many different, there have been a few primary changes at the federal level that have been discussed. I know this committee has looked at the tax treatment of forgiven PPP loans in particular. This would bring into Vermont, it would follow the federal tax treatment for tax year 2020. So that would allow both the exclusion from gross income for forgiven PPP loans and the deductibility for tax year 2020. It does not address tax year 21. So those are the two main, I know those are the two main issues that have been discussed: PPP loan treatment and unemployment compensation.
Okay, and the recommendation we sent to APROPS, but they missed the second clause, was to extend it through March 31st, which would have brought in the unemployment treatment. What the other body's done is that it's up through December 31st, which takes the PPP in, and then said, oh, and by the way, we will also, rather than extend the date, they've just specifically said, we will also treat unemployment the same way, but we will hold to Vermont law where when looking at your household income for property taxes, because you could have someone that's still fully employed in a household, or two people and one person on unemployment. So all right, so that's how they're dealing with it. Are they also looking at a way to deal with the link up, which we do retroactively every year? Usually it's on miscellaneous tax and we get it about now. And people are well into filing their income taxes. And are they, is there something coming over to us in that, or are they going to hold that, for another bill? Is that where the
miscellaneous tax bill has been passed out of the House. I believe will be walking your committee through it. That does not have any link up language in it.
No, that's where it used to be. I mean,
Right.
almost every year it would be there. Last year, I think it went in the budget, or it didn't. It got bounced around a few times last year because miscellaneous tax was in trouble.
That's correct.
Okay.
So
do you know what they're thinking in that area?
So there are discussions about going forward, the tax year 2021. So that would be any prospective changes. There's no agreement around that as of this moment. So this is, again, because the way that the link up typically is done, there aren't these federal changes that are happening, state of affairs. So typically it happens retroactively and there aren't as many or as such large revenue impact as these federal changes have created for the state. I think the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is really the closest parallel to what you're facing now, with such a huge overhaul.
But that we knew in advance, I mean, at least far enough in advance, so we adjusted the tax code to react to it. I've never known changes to come over that were pretty much retroactive. And I guess the question that gets begged is, are we going to change a system that's worked perfectly well for years because we had this once in a generation just emergency that all bets have been off? Okay, but I know they're working at trying to find a way not to link up retroactively. I'm not sure. Senator Pearson.
I wanted to ask your question maybe another way. Is there another mechanism than a late link up? Is that sort of what you're asking, Madam Chair?
Yes, that's what they're.
I've wondered too, like, could we have a default that we link up unless, some move, or, I mean, the legislature could always act, but shift this uncomfortable position where we're forced really to backwards, to retroactively do something, otherwise we create chaos. Is that so? It's a mechanism. Is that sort of what you're asking?
Yeah, I think that's what they're trying to find. I think we're all feeling somewhat boxed in, and it's a boxed in that's going to cost us, I think between the two, aren't we somewhere between 24 and $25 million? And I think that's concerning. It may never happen again, but it has. Senator Sirotkin.
So I'm sorry if I missed this, but in the House, are they talking about parallel treatment for the PPP retroactive as well as the UI, or have they already decided on the PPP and it's just the UI that's the orphan out here?
So that's a good question, because the PPP treatment in the HR 133, which is the December Consolidated Appropriations Act, so that came very, very late in the year. That has both tax year 20 implications and tax year 21 implications. So this bill, or what the House Ways and Means Committee is looking at, is pulling in everything from 2020, but only as it applies. So sorry, pulling in everything in federal statute as of the end of 2020 and only applying it to tax year 2020 in Vermont. So that would allow the federal treatment of PPP for tax year 20, but it leaves open the question of what Vermont will do in tax year 21 for PPP. And then, because this is only through the end of December of 2020, it only pulls in the UI provision. It doesn't bring in any of the other changes in the Rescue Plan Act. Those are still
So
under discussion.
they're treating both retroactive policies the same, is their suggestion at this point.
That's correct, allowing those to flow through for tax year 20.
Right. Which is what we had talked about doing, even if it was somewhat reluctantly. Senator Bray.
Since this federal interpretation, it has unfavorable implications for the state, does that create any opportunity for the state to in some way make a claim on monies that we would otherwise not be eligible for? Like, does this become a CARES cost, a COVID cost to the state of Vermont that then legitimately can receive, they would in essence be backfilling the payment? Because if it weren't for their decision, we wouldn't be facing that cost, which makes it seem to me like a COVID cost. So I can see this is causing
Right now, I think I can tell you there isn't 24
how can you
million.
do that? You're
Yeah.
not going to do that to the feds.
I'm usually thinking this is worthy of Senator Sirotkin. There's not 24 million that I know of left in the CARES money. And the ARPA money, I haven't heard the details yet. I think they're still working, but it's a very different system.
Right.
Um,
So I don't really know which bucket to go to, but for this related change by the feds, we're incurring a cost, and it's related to their interpretation around pandemic-related events. And it just makes me wonder, not that we would get a new check for 24 million, but something that was being treated as ineligible for CARES money or some other type of federal money might be arguably now eligible for that. I suppose this is a little bit of a David and Goliath effort, but anyway, it made me wonder if there's a way to recover.
okay, Senator Sirotkin.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay. I'm having trouble hearing you. So
I'll move in.
it's an unfortunate situation we're in. I'm generally not a fan of being dictated what our tax policy is or giving up $24 million. I think when I talked to Graham, I thought the number was more like 6 million on PPP and 12 million on UI. I don't know how
That's what I thought, but then I heard 12 million on PPP, but it's
okay. I don't know.
in there.
But, I guess things could be worse. We couldn't have all this federal money coming our way, and we couldn't have $200 million set aside for one times in FY22 that we've been trying to advance. So, we sort of have a gun to our head. I'm not sure we have much of a choice here but to extend these federal tax cuts to the state level as well.
With a gun to our head, we're asking them to pay for the bullets at least. That's all right.
Do you know what is the total revenue loss? I thought that PPP was a lot less than the UI in impact. But then I heard 12, and that may have just been a misquote from whomever I heard it from.
Yeah, it's a little bit confusing, and even I trying to figure it
Not
out.
all me, okay.
So in terms of what gets booked for revenue impact, it is $12.6 million to the negative in fiscal year 21. And it's my understanding that Steve, with the help of the appropriations committee, have crafted language to sort of cover that issue. The PPP is not really being booked as a revenue loss, because my understanding after speaking with Tom again is that he built in some of this into the forecast itself. So he kind of assumed that we were going to link up because that's how we had done it in previous years, the retroactive look back. And so that's kind of already built in. So what I would say is that doesn't necessarily have a fiscal impact in fiscal year 21 in the same way that the UI does. Now, if the legislature decoupled from forgiven loans in tax year 21 going forward, that would be a revenue up in the forecast, if that makes sense.
Okay. So we
And
are in
that's- and that's
fiscal year 21, which is our fiscal year that ends in July or July 1st. But we're looking at taxes filed for last year, which is a calendar year, which is tax year 20, that are paid in 21. I think that's where some of the confusion is coming from. So going forward, if we do as the other body is suggesting, for tax year 20, which will hit the revenue for the budget we're developing now, correct?
No, for
No.
fiscal 21, it's what you've already crafted. Like last or in September.
Okay,
Yes. So impact that. And so
okay, that's why the 12 million hole had, all right,
right. And so my understanding, and I have to make sure I'm explaining this correctly, but the way they're thinking about handling it is they're going to borrow from the caseload reserve this year and then pay it back if there is any surplus revenue at the end of the fiscal year. And if there's not any revenue in the future at the end of this fiscal year that's surplus, then they'll handle it in fiscal year 22.
okay. So when we talk about tax year 21, we're talking about revenue that will go into the budget that we are presently developing. And that for the PPP, the House is saying, and I think we've said that we're not guaranteeing now. What about the UI?
Right.
Does
So
that go forward?
So on the UI in the House is what Abby, that language described to you, that would pass through, and that's for tax year 20, and that impacts fiscal year 21. So that $12.6 million down is on fiscal year 21. For PPP, it's an impact that spreads across multiple years. So there was, we think, an impact in fiscal year 21, so tax year 20. But this language would pick that provision up. And so, but that's what I'm saying was already put into the forecast as an assumption. And so if the House or if the legislature in general said, we don't want to pick up that PPP loan forgiveness taxability in tax year 21, then it would be an up on the fiscal year 22 budget. So it would create revenues for the fiscal year 22 budget that you're building right now. But the tax year 20 loans that were forgiven, if you link up, that's just sort of, that was the assumption in the forecast.
Okay, so we knew or highly supposed that those loans that got created turned into grants. That wasn't a shock, right? That they were going to be tax exempt. What was the shock was you could also deduct the expenses that you pay, so you got tax-free money that you could also deduct. If you paid payroll with it, you could deduct it. That's what was the surprise, right? Or complete surprise. Because normally you get tax-free money, don't get to double deduct it or double, all right.
That's right. Yeah. And so the treatment of those loans, you can either make the forgiven loan itself taxable, or you can prevent the deductibility. In Abby and I's reading of this, at least in terms of administration and timing, it might be better to just make the loan itself taxable, because the expenses for PPP loans have likely already happened, or the vast majority of the money has already been spent for PPP loans, but the forgiveness is going to keep coming over the next couple of years. And so to the extent that this, if you made it the PPP loans taxable, then you're more, the revenue that I'm talking about, 5 million or 6 million or so, that's what would be realized. If you decoupled from the expense part, it would be a different number, because most of the expenses have already happened in tax year 20.
Okay, all right, so they've paid their payroll, because that's what they were supposed to.
Yeah,
But that was when it was a loan.
that was one of
So
the-
they've gotten to deduct their payroll costs. But that loan may not get converted over until next year to a grant. And what, do we want to say the loans, or we want to say when they get converted to a grant, they become taxable?
That's correct. That's, if you wanted to decouple, that's how you, and you wanted to rate, and there was, you wanted to hit that $5 million number that I'm talking about in fiscal year 22, that's how you would do it. Because if you did the deductibility, then what I'm saying is that you sort of already missed the boat on that, because the deducted expenses have already happened in calendar year 20.
Okay.
But the loans themselves don't get forgiven until after you prove that you've used the money. So we think that a lot of the loans will be forgiven in calendar year 21.
Okay. Any questions? None. All right. Thoughts? Are we comfortable with the direction I think is going to come to us, which is we swallow it for tax year 20. And then for 21, we're going to take the time to go back and decide if we are going to pass on, if we are going to say, all right, but for state purposes, PPP, when it becomes a grant, is taxable. And and how long is the exclusion for UI? Is that just for tax year 20? Yes. Okay, so we don't have to do anything unless we want to say we're going to exclude it further than that. But hopefully by then we will be out of at least the health emergency, and more people will be back to work. We won't have the kind of crisis level we've had. All right. So if that's what comes back to us, is that where the committee's thinking was going? Yes, okay. All right,
We're all asleep, but isn't that what we
we're
already?
all asleep. Hasn't
already-
been that long a day.
Is the question,
We already
what are we gonna do
decided it,
this
right?
year, or what are we
Wait,
gonna do next year, or both?
This is what we're going to do for this year. The taxes that are now due May 17th. The taxable income for last year
We'll take the loss.
will take the loss.
Okay.
All
Next
right,
year,
next year is open to our discretion. We will have to make that decision before we're going home. But it sounds like the UI tax deductibility is only for 1 year. So that's gone away. The PPP, the suggestion is that we make the loans taxable when they are converted to grants, because most of the expenses have already been deducted this year. Does that make sense?
I got lost. So
Okay,
we'll
where'd you
take,
get
the
lost?
recommendation is, the first half of it is, we'll take the loss this year. It's too complicated to correct it.
Right,
And the choice is that the following year, we'll either reach back and claw it back, or we will ignore it, or we will do the third thing, which is,
the third thing is we will declare the PPP loans taxable at when they become converted to grants. They come out as loans. I don't think we tax any other loans as income. So we do tax loans as income?
no,
I'm
no.
s- No, I was seeing some head shaking.
We haven't done any
No.
of these things before.
Right.
So there's no
Right,
precedent.
so they've got loans. In order to be converted to grants, they have to show that they use those loans to do the things the feds said they had to do. But that means by the time it gets converted to a grant, many, if not most or all of those expenses have been deducted from this year's income tax, because they were supposed to be paying their payroll this past year. So they paid their payroll. So we're not going to be able to claw that back, not without a law of clawing on other people's parts. So next year we'll say, but going forward, any loan that gets converted to a grant, that grant becomes taxable income. And then you can still deduct the expenses.
So we're saying, we'll take the loss this year because we can't do anything about it, but next year, we're not going to take the loss and we will get the money. We won't lose that money.
Right. I think,
So
is,
That's,
if I,
if that's what it
I'm
is, that's
looking
pretty
around,
simple.
does anyone think that's not what we're hearing or agreeing?
With me.
Commissioner Bolio has raised his hand. Commissioner, there you are.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner. I mean, just to clarify, I don't think that's the language that's coming over to you. The language
Oh.
that's coming over to you talks just about tax year 20 and leaves everything
Yes.
for tax year 21, PPP,
Right.
EITC, all the other CARES Act, all the other H-133, all the other ARPA stuff. It's silent on that
Right.
and leaves that up to a future legislative discussion. And
Well, if it's
I mean,
next tax year, we're gonna have to do it before
Back
we
in the
go
same
home.
boat. Back in the same
Uh,
boat.
Yeah, so what I've testified to in Ways and Means on this is I'm fine with that structure, but it does mean that the legislature has to have an additional discussion before you folks head home.
Yes.
And that's consistent with what I talked about with this committee on Friday, which was why don't we separate 20 and 21, solve the 20 problem, talk about the 2021. And I'm happy with that outcome.
Okay.
But yeah, the language that you guys are going to get, I think, will not have anything about 2021 in it. And I
Right,
would recommend that we handle those separately.
And I think what Graham has said is, it sounds like the taxation of unemployment is only for 1 year. So that's not going to be an issue next year unless we decide we want to make it tax exempt. And that the PPP, probably the best thing if we want to tax that is to do it at the point of conversion to a loan, but that's a further discussion. I think right now, what I'm hearing, and they're still working on some way so we don't get caught in this retroactive forms. I don't know if they can find a way to do it, but we'll see what they do with that. But that's my understanding of what's coming back. And I think that's kind of where we all are.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that retroactive piece if you'd like, Madam Chair. I can be brief.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the main question that the legislature has to decide is, do you want to do static conformity on a prospective basis, or do you want to do static conformity on a retroactive basis? There are other options, right? The legislature could choose to just have rolling conformity, which a whole bunch of states have, but it means you automatically grab all the federal stuff, and there are legal and constitutional questions that I think you'd have to tackle that I'm sure Abby could speak to very effectively. And then there's the full decoupling that you could do. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to, Abby and Graham put a whole memo on this together, and I'm not looking to steal their thunder, but just, I think the big question that we've identified is, if you want to stay static conformity, both the legislature and the department have been happy to operate in the world where it's retroactive and links up to current year. And that's what leads the department to then make the assumption, okay, that's probably what we'll do every year, which created some challenges this year. One of the things that we've identified at the department is that operationally, one thing that you can do, regardless of where the legislature lands on wanting to be retroactive or prospective, many states have what I'm calling escape hatches in their forms, which are reserved lines, usually on schedules, not on the main form, that allow for more nimble adjustments later in the season. The big challenge that we talked about right now is changing things, is changing our system, changing vendor system, changing our forms and instructions, and adding new lines and subtracting new things is really tough. If you have some lines that are reserved, I've got to be clear, it's still tough, but it is less devastating, right? Because it's not adding new lines to the system. It's just communicating with vendors new instructions on how to handle those lines. So regardless of where this lands, the tax department is planning to implement a couple of what I'm calling these escape hatches on our forms moving forward to try to help resolve this kind of issue. But there's still a timing issue if you want to do static conformity, which is we don't assume, we do it prospectively, which means the forms will not assume link up to anything that comes later in the year. And then if the legislature really likes that stuff, it's hard for us to conform to, or it assumes retroactive. And then it's really hard to decouple. So that's what we're struggling with. There's no magic solution here. There's no option that makes a year like this year smooth sailing.
Hopefully, this will be a once in a generation year. I think most of us are hoping we don't go through a year-long pandemic and isolation again, but one never knows. Okay. Committee, any other thoughts, questions? Anything? Okay. Thank you, Commissioner and Abby and Graham. I think that's it for today. We'll be back tomorrow. We're still going through the bills that have been sent to us, and then we'll sit down and decide which ones we're going to go further on. 3:15, as soon as I see what comes out of Ways and Means, we'll get it out to you, and we'll take a look at what they finally come up with and see if we need more testimony, and then go from there. All right, does that work? Okay, some of us have been sitting in these seats since 9 o'clock this morning, so I think we're all ready for a break. Thank you.